Continuing our coverage tonight of some of the reaction to Ottawa's new carbon tax carve-outs and Rural Economic Development Minister Goody Hutchings' comments to CTV that if the rest of the country wants to secure similar carve-outs, they could elect more Liberals. Danielle Smith is Alberta's Premier. Have a listen to our conversation. Hi, Premier Smith. Good to welcome you back to our program. Thanks for making the time.
You bet, my pleasure.
I wanted to start off and just ask you, Premier Moe is responding to these changes with the federal carbon tax program by saying that if Saskatchewan and natural gas doesn't get the same carve-out, he's going to order Sask Energy by January 1st to stop collecting the tax. I think the market works a bit differently in Alberta, but are you entertaining some sort of similar position?
Well, that's the advantage Saskatchewan has of having a Crown corporation, is that they can do that kind of action, whereas in Alberta, we've got a private market with private industry players. I commend Premier Moe on taking an action like that. He acknowledges that it's probably not legal from that standpoint. But I wouldn't ask our industry here to take any actions that would be illegal, that would cause the federal government to punish them. I think that this requires a political solution. And the political solution is clearly to let the federal government acknowledge that they have made a mistake here, that they need to be providing the fuel tax relief on all home heating, all types of fuel in all parts of the country. They shouldn't be pitting one region against another, and shouldn't be saying that one Canadian is more harmed by this tax than another. If it's a harmful tax in winter in Atlantic Canada, it's a harmful tax in winter in Alberta. And he should acknowledge that and take the tax off.
Have you had any private conversations with the Prime Minister, for example, or pursued that kind of angle rather than publicly lambasting them in order to secure that type of carve-out for Canadians in your province?
You know, we have been calling for an end to the carbon tax ever since I got elected. We knew what kind of pain it was causing in our province, especially when we get into the depths of winter and it's minus 30 and people have to turn their furnaces on. We now have a carbon tax that I think is almost equivalent to the cost of natural gas, and is only going to go up. So we've been calling for an end to the retail carbon tax. We think that we can reduce carbon emissions a different way, by working with our big industrial players, by having technological change, by bringing on different sources of heating and different sources of power. But to be punishing residents who don't really have any choice other than to use natural gas, that's just not fair. It's causing harm, and now it's dividing the country. He's got to stop doing this and just take the tax off completely on home heating for this winter.
I certainly understand the point that you're making publicly here. I guess my question is whether or not, since, for example, the announcement last Thursday, you've pursued a private conversation with the Prime Minister in order to try and secure this for Albertans, as opposed to what might be more politically expedient, which is calling him out publicly.
Well, you know, it's not like the Prime Minister is very easy to get on the phone. I've talked to him a handful of times in the time that I've been Premier. And we do have a table where my ministers are meeting with his ministers, our deputy ministers are meeting with his deputy ministers. And so I think he's the one who made the blunder. He's the one who went out in public and announced this ludicrous policy and began the process of unraveling the carbon tax, because the whole basis for him to argue at the Supreme Court that he should have the right to be able to set this federally was so that the same tax applied in the province in the same way, and that everybody would be treated fairly. So he's the one who's breaking the rules on this. And so I would say he has to be called to account for it. And he's got to fix it. And the easiest way to fix it right now is to take the fuel tax off of all forms of home heating.
Outside, though, of the home heating oil, there are other parts of this carve-out, which includes a doubling of the rebate for rural Canada, for rural Canadians, which would include portions of Alberta. Goody Hutchings, the Minister for Rural Economic Development, today wrote, in response to some of the backlash she got for the other comment she made, that a rising tide lifts all boats. The doubled rural top-up and temporary pause of the fuel charge on home heating oil apply anywhere the federal program is in place. The heat pump incentive will be available anywhere we have an agreement with provinces or territories, or when we do. Is that not true? I mean, there are rural Canadians in Alberta who will benefit from what the government announced.
As I understand it, you can't get insurance on a heat pump system in anywhere that goes below minus 20 degrees Celsius. You have to have a backup. We are routinely below 20 degrees Celsius in our province in winter. Heat pumps are not the solution. I think what he has to acknowledge is that he went too far, too fast with a punitive tax that no one could afford. And this is an affordability crisis. And that's the real issue here. That's why we have called for an end to the carbon tax, as we're dealing with an inflation crisis. And he accepted that for one part of the country. He needs to now accept that every part of the country is feeling the same pain and take the same action.
Some federal Liberals I spoke with today were pushing back against the criticism that you and, for example, Premier Moe were levying, in particular in your case, saying that basically you're accusing the Prime Minister of impeding on or infringing on national unity. But at the same time, you're floating the idea, for example, of leaving the Canada Pension Plan. And they called it ironic that you'd be kind of crusading against him for doing the same thing.
Well, they're two different things. We went to court because we didn't think that they had the authority to have a carbon tax. The Supreme Court sided with the federal government on the basis that they were going to be applying this fairly, and they felt that every single Canadian had to pay it. And now the federal government are breaking their own rules. And so I think that that actually might require us to go back to the Supreme Court, since they're not living up to what it is that they told the court they intended to do. They're making exceptions, they're not applying it fairly. That's what Canadians are concerned about. And I think that he's invited this criticism. He can fix it really quickly by treating every region of the province fairly, and either keeping the fuel tax on in Atlantic Canada, although I doubt he'll want to do that. The better solution would be to eliminate it everywhere.
So the rural rebate, though, is not just particular to Atlantic Canada. Do you really think if you went back to the Supreme Court based on a 3-year pause, you're going to get a different decision? Well,
it's not going to get any easier in winter to heat our homes. When we were fighting it before the Supreme Court, they hadn't acknowledged that they were going to increase it to $170 per ton. We're only halfway there. It's only going to get worse. And so if it's this bad now, and this punitive now, and this harmful now, that they're having to make exceptions, that says to me that the entire program has to be rethought. They've made a mistake, and they have to acknowledge that.
But the decision, pardon me, Premier, the decision of the Supreme Court was that they had the right to levy a tax based on climate change concerns in the way that they did. I'm unsure how a pause, for example, on one item is necessarily going to change the entire genesis of the decision.
It's the unfairness of it all. Like, this is the point. The federal government should be applying taxes equally across the country. They shouldn't be pick and choosing in areas that choose to elect more Liberals than those areas that don't, and rewarding them because of some political calculation. That's not how our laws are supposed to work, and that's not how the federal power is supposed to work. So they're the ones who I think have undermined their very arguments for the carbon tax. First of all, they said that it wasn't punitive, that the rebate was enough, and now clearly they don't believe that's the case because they're having to increase the rebate, and they're also having to provide a special deal to those who are on home heating, or home heating oil. So I think that the entire basis on which they built this carbon tax is flawed. And if you start seeing other provinces take matters into their own hands, in Saskatchewan, them saying, well, we're not going to collect it on natural gas, who knows what other provinces are going to do? That completely undermines the system, and he needs to get ahead of it. He's created the problem. He's now got to solve it.
Premier, I just have a few seconds left, but I did want to ask you about something your finance minister told me over the weekend. I was asking about any kind of objective data that you will determine whether or not to hold a referendum on when it comes to leaving the CPP. He didn't have any details for me in that regard, and he said it would be a feeling that your government derives from the consultations it conducts. Can you understand how Albertans might hear that you're going to base that decision on a feeling and be worried?
Well, I guess what I've heard is that Albertans want to see a solid number, and so do we. So we've asked the federal government if they don't like our calculation and they think we've misinterpreted the act to tell us what they think the number is. We've also asked the CPPIB Investment Board as well to do the same thing. So once we get that number, then we'll have a better idea of whether Albertans want to go to a referendum on the basis of the calls we received to MLA offices, the survey results, the consultations Jim Dinning is doing, polling. All of that will give us a sense of where Albertans are at. It's not one individual source. It's going to be all of that. So we have more consultation to do over the next couple of months. But the most important thing is getting a firm number, and we've asked the federal government for that, and hopefully they'll deliver on it.
If you get that number, though, are you going to actually put to Albertans in any sort of capacity prior to the actual referendum a question about whether or not they actually want to pursue this? Because I looked through the survey, that question is never asked. It's just how it's managed, by whom. It's never a question of whether or not it's going to happen. Will that ever be put to them in order to determine whether or not it's worth a referendum?
Well, that's what a referendum would be about, is whether or not we would stay with the federal plan or whether there's enough reason to go and create an Alberta pension plan. And I think the Albertans have raised really great points with us. They want to know exactly what the number of the transfer would be. They want to know exactly what would be the impact on premiums and what the increase in benefits would be. I think that's reasonable. And so we've got a little bit more work to do to get those numbers. And then we'll have a better idea once we've put that out to the public of whether they want to have a vote on it.
Okay, Premier, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.